You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.
Welcome to the Campus podcast, in which we're talking climate change, or more specifically, how universities can lead the fight against it. I'm Miranda Prynne, campus editor, and joining me today is, drum roll,
Eliza Compton, the deputy editor of Campus.
And Eliza and I have the rare treat of recording together in person today, which is helpful when discussing the great existential crisis of our time. So, a few fun facts to start us off. 2024 was the hottest year on record, and 2025 is not far behind according to the latest data. Today, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere is about 50% higher than in 1750 at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, which massively exceeds the natural changes which have taken place over the preceding 800,000 years, according to the IPCC. And many experts are now warning that we are very likely to exceed 1.5 degrees in global temperature rises in the long term. But there is also growing evidence of other very viable ways forward. We now can see entire nations which are almost entirely powered by renewable energy. So to name a few, Costa Rica, Norway, Iceland, and renewables are becoming ever more efficient and effective and accessible. So again, to take an example, solar panels, which are produced today, only need to operate for 4 to 8 months to make up for their manufacturing emissions. And the average solar panel has a lifetime of around 25 to 30 years. Now, universities, where do they sit in all this? I mean, clearly, as engines of innovation, research and learning, universities have a massive part to play in developing solutions and green technologies and driving sustainable behaviour change. But if they are to lead by example, they have a long way to go. Global higher education accounts for about 18.1 million tonnes of carbon dioxide annually. So, while thousands of institutions have committed to achieving net zero, and many of them by 2030, progress does remain patchy.
Yeah, as you said, Miranda, universities have really embraced net zero goals, and many of them have shared a lot of their strategies with us on campus. So the things that they are doing range from smart buildings to partnering with landowners in carbon capture, recycling programs, and then more day-to-day tips like simply turning the lights off. But they are really huge, complex organisations, so understanding their own footprint and their environmental impact, I imagine, must be a huge challenge, which perhaps goes some way to mitigating the progress, or perhaps the lack of progress in some eyes. But we do have many success stories, and one of the ways that universities can evidence this work is through the Times Higher Education Impact Rankings, which is coming up soon, the 2025 edition that will be released on Wednesday, the 18th of June. And this gives universities an opportunity to show off and showcase in a much more granular fashion the incredible work that they're doing. So we have an overall ranking, but we also have individual rankings mapped against the 17 UN sustainability goals. So sustainable cities, clean energy, or climate action, for example.
Yes, as you say, there is a huge amount of fantastic and really admirable work by very impassioned individuals, both on the staff and the student side within universities, but they are very, very complex organisations, and really the complexity and diversity of approaches needed is reflected, I'd say, in our conversations today as we speak to two women driving positive change through very, very different mechanisms. So, Eliza, briefly, can you tell us who you spoke to?
Yes, I spoke to Jenna Lowe, who is the Laboratory Sustainability Officer at the University of Liverpool, and an absolute font of knowledge on how to use less energy, less plastic in the pursuit of science.
Yeah, so that conversation really focuses on the small everyday actions or adaptations of approach in a very specific area of university life, but it really demonstrates what a massive difference these actions can make. Whereas my conversation examined a more macro approach, looking at how universities can leverage their investment powers to drive positive change. I spoke to Ellen Quigley, who is Principal Research Associate, the Co-Director of Finance for Environmental and Social Systemic Change, and Special Advisor on Responsible Investment to the Chief Financial Officer, all at the University of Cambridge. Now, both these interviews perhaps also reflect the fact that universities have got to get smarter about how they reduce emissions, as a lot of the more obvious, I guess, I mean, easy is maybe the wrong word to use, but a lot of those slightly easier wins have been done. This is evidenced by a significant slowdown in the year-on-year reductions. But as Ellen, who we'll hear from first, explains, there are some relatively simple steps that universities' finance departments can take that could create ripple effects well beyond their campus walls. Hi, Ellen. Great to talk to you today.
Lovely to be here with you, Miranda.
Thank you for joining us. There's a huge amount of energy and focus across all of UK higher education on reaching net zero. And a lot of the actions taken are inevitably echoed across all institutions. So, sourcing green energy, improving efficiencies across campus relating to transport, catering, reducing plastic use, and so on. But Cambridge appears to be leading the charge from a slightly different angle, using its investment power to influence and drive change. Now, Jesus College offers a particularly notable example, as I gather the college has redesigned its responsible investment policy to focus on using shareholder influence to vote against companies engaging in harmful practices. Could you tell us a bit more about this and how it came about and how it now works?
Happily. So the Jesus College investment policy was written by the bursar, Dr. Richard Anthony, and it emerged really out of the work that we've been doing collectively for many years now. The bursars have almost all been working together on a number of projects that pull from the research in this area. So I'm an academic, I study this stuff, and what we're able to do is deploy the emerging research, test it in the real world, and see what's actually more likely to be effective. And that is reflected in this policy, a lot of the things that we've tested, and actually one of the other projects that we've been working on emerged from Richard the Bursar, which is a focus on cash, with the 75 higher education institutions that got behind a cash request for proposals. And it's based on this insight that that's one of the ways in which companies can raise new money through their cash portfolio. So those are a couple of things about that policy that you're right, you wouldn't often see in another policy that's more kind of typically ESG. And that's because these are things that have been found to be more impactful from a research perspective. So it's really using practice and research and building each off the other.
Yeah, that must be really satisfactory as a researcher to be seeing your findings applied in a very practical context.
Exactly.
Are there any tangible outcomes you could point to, and sort of impact that it's had so far?
So the cash element of the policy, we're actually about to launch finally the cash product that has arisen out of that with those other higher education institutions. But we have actually already seen some shifts in voting behavior on the part of the asset managers that the various bursars engage with collectively, because we're really just asking them to focus on votes against directors of companies that are causing a disproportionate negative impact on the climate, which means that we're not asking them about the director votes of all companies. We're just asking them about the top 60 banks financing fossil fuel expansion, the top 30 insurers facilitating fossil fuel expansion, And then the CA, the Climate Action 100 plus companies, and that's a set of companies that represent a large proportion of real economy listed emitters that investors tend to engage with.
Okay, so it really is about sort of spreading the net of influence by encouraging the shareholders that you engage with to vote against these directors, but it's quite sort of targeted.
Yes, it's we found so this is quite interesting. One of the things that we used to do was to circulate a pretty long questionnaire. I mean, I thought it was short. I had shortened it, but it was nevertheless probably 20 questions. We used to circulate that, and the asset managers would complete it, but do nothing off the back of it. And we noticed that after a while, it felt like quite a silly exercise. And our social psychologist colleagues informed us that probably the asset managers were viewing the questionnaire as the task to complete, as opposed to a means to a different end. And so we started just scrapping the questionnaire and really only asking about director votes at those top high impact companies. And that seemed to get a much greater level of focus on that really key metric.
Brilliant. And then you talk about the cash investments. You might have to unpick that a bit for someone like myself who is not well versed in the world of finance. So what exactly does that mean in practice, and what difference could that particular product make?
So basically, there are a couple of different forms in which an institution like a college or a university will have their cash. So one is just in deposits in banks, and often it'll be those will be spread across many banks because you have to do that for risk management purposes. And then sometimes there will be kind of a short-term debt fund. I can get into the technical detail, but it's probably not necessary. It's just basically like a little investment fund, but it's meant to be short term and liquid, so you can get your money in and out very quickly and easily. So those two pots we targeted with this cash request for proposals. And basically what we're doing is we're approving, according to the criteria of the request for proposals, a small list of banking institutions that do not contribute to fossil fuel expansion through their financing, underwriting activities. And we've identified 6 such banking institutions now, mainly building societies and other types of institutions from the UK. We think we might have gotten a full service bank over the line in the last week or so, which is pretty incredible. And so please expect an announcement. And then on the short-term money market fund side of things, we have chosen an asset manager with a good voting record to actually build the very first cash product that will not include any company engaging in fossil fuel expansion or financing or underwriting such fossil fuel expansion.
So that's much more about the places that the money is being placed have been carefully vetted and are aligned to the values and the criteria that this investment strategy focuses on. That's brilliant. Does this reflect the university's policy more broadly, or is Jesus College an outlier in being so focused on this?
I wouldn't say they're an outlier anymore. They're definitely ahead in the field more generally, but this collaboration has happened across the collegiate university, the trusts, and Cambridge University Press and Assessment, almost all of the colleges, and then of course the Central University itself has liquid funds, cash, that they're also working with us very, very intensively with. So our head of group treasury, Heather Davis, has been fantastic on that. Our CFO, Anthony Odgers. So everyone is kind of working together on the same types of things. And in general, the work that we do tends to reflect the things that we've learned, namely that director votes are a particularly powerful tool on the public equity side, but debt is really where the vast majority of new money flowing into fossil fuel companies comes from. So that's why we're focused on this money market, or the cash side of things, and on bonds.
Yeah, and I mean, it offers really, really useful lessons for others, because if more organizations, whether in higher education or further afield, started taking a similar approach, it could have an extraordinarily powerful effect. On this as a strategy, up until now, there's been a huge amount of talk and indeed pressure put on universities around divestment. And I wondered where you felt, or what you felt were the pros and cons really of this responsible investment approach, where you try and use influence to have a positive impact versus divestment in driving change.
So I will be a bit of a contrarian here and say that most responsible investment, as it's practiced now, is pretty useless. It tends to involve exclusions or tilts in the public equity portfolio, but often not on the bond side. It involves, private engagements that are oriented towards getting the companies to voluntarily produce not very good data, shareholder resolutions, which have not been found to be particularly effective, etc. On the other hand, divestment, I think, is considered to be a little bit more of a spiky thing to do. But I actually think there is now emerging evidence to suggest that actually the combination of engagement and divestment is more likely to produce outcomes relative to either tactic in and of itself. So if you look at what we're doing with this cash product, for example, what we're doing is we're kind of salami slicing services away from banks that are engaging in fossil fuel expansion while still retaining some relationship and just gradually withdrawing those services, and with then the seriousness of our demands being reflected in the concern on the part of the banks that we might actually shift relationships over to another bank entirely. So it's the spikiness of the engagement that comes from that threat of divestment, that in just like showing how serious you are, that is associated with better outcomes with the engagement itself. So I don't view those two things as being opposites. I think that there is a complementarity that's often not acknowledged.
Yes, which makes total sense that divestment as a relatively blunt tool needs to be there as a backstop. But as you say, a much more targeted and strategic approach, looking at the situation and working out what's going to have the greatest impact or the greatest influence, is much more sensible. And of course, as you've already explained, in the case of Jesus College, this is based on research. So, it's got good foundations. Am I right in thinking your own research focuses on working with large asset owners to harness their financial resources for broader good?
Yes, that's exactly right.
Can you tell me a bit about that?
Sure. The reason that I focus on asset owners is really for two main reasons. One is that they tend to be more aligned with the purpose of society as a whole, and they have a lack of the conflicts of interest that have been documented in the asset manager space. And then the other is just that they are at the top of the food chain in the investment world, despite being so much less conflicted. So they have a lot of power and a lot less of an inclination to misuse that power than other entities within the financial system. And I work within a construct called universal ownership theory, and basically that gives you the sense that most of your returns are the same as market returns. So if you have systemic risks from, say, runaway climate change that could affect the whole portfolio, you have to actually work on things that will have a real world effect in order to protect your portfolio as a whole.
Right. So there's an element of self-interest in it, essentially.
Yes, exactly. So it's kind of a financial justification for doing things that actually probably aligns with a lot of people's moral intuitions, but it is with that financial basis. You're right.
Yeah. Well, always good to give that incentive, the personal incentive, alongside the doing good. It's interesting you say that asset owners have less inclination to misuse their power. I mean, is that just because they're less answerable to people?
Oh, that's such a great question. No, I would just say this. Their incentive or your job as a pension fund is to pay out decent pensions to people in decades' time. And usually you could get paid more to go work on the asset management side of the business. And on the asset management side of the business, your goal is to increase the assets under management, so to attract new clients and to keep the fees as high as possible, basically increase your own remuneration. And that doesn't necessarily map on to actually paying out to beneficiaries, 30, 40, 50 years from now. So that it's a pretty fundamental conflict and difference in approach between those two groups of investors.
Yeah, I can see that as a completely different motivation.
Hmm.
Just moving on, I read about the University of Cambridge and Bloomberg's new global corporate bond index covering fossil fuel producers, utilities, insurance, and financing, and that this has been created essentially to support investment strategies that are focused on companies working to reduce emissions. Now, can you explain in layman's terms exactly what this offers and why it's going to be so helpful?
Thank you. Let's see if I can do that. So I guess it's worth just backing up for one moment to say that a large majority of emissions come from fossil fuel combustion, and a very large proportion of the new capital flowing into fossil fuel expansion comes from debt. So bank loans or bonds. Bonds are basically financial instruments that are issued by the companies themselves when they need to borrow money from the market. And what we're doing is we're creating an index. So that's like a recipe for a more or less representative slice of the whole bond market so that you can get broad exposure to everything. But our index takes out any company that is building new fossil fuel infrastructure, including new gas-fired power plants or liquefied natural gas terminals, and any company that's still exploring for new reserves or expanding new fields. So any fossil fuel expansion activity. We're also taking out the top financiers and facilitators in the banking and insurance industries of those companies that are engaging in fossil fuel expansion, so that we can basically have the first bond index that does not direct new money into fossil fuel expansion.
Okay, so they are simply removed as an option from this particular bond index.
Yes, with the banks and insurers, there will still be some banks and insurers in there that are heavily underweighted. There's a kind of a different methodology for the financial sector part of this. But with the fossil fuel companies and utilities that are engaging in fossil fuel expansion themselves, they will all be excluded from the index unless they halt fossil fuel expansion activity and adopt a science-based phase down trajectory. And by the way, we're not going with commitments here. We're going with actual activities. We want to know what companies are actually doing, not whether they are classified as a particular kind of company. It's really about their behavior.
I was about to say, I presume there's some sort of basis upon which companies will be looked at, and you've just touched on that, which is very helpful. So I know this is in very early stages. Are you optimistic this could have quite a powerful impact? I mean, within the huge world of finance and the many different metrics and instruments available, how big a difference could this make?
It's really unclear at this stage. If we do end up with a number of very large investors investing against it, the impact could be quite substantial indeed. We do have the UN Joint Staff Pension Fund committing up to 500 million already, and Cambridge itself putting in about 200 million. So that's already very good pre-launch. And the thing is that there isn't anything like this for any bond investor who would like to do something about fossil fuel expansion. So in a way, if we can actually coalesce around this approach, we can put more directed pressure on the companies focusing on fossil fuel expansion, as opposed to often you'll see these products with dozens or more indicators about their greenness. Many of these are gameable. It's much better to just look at actual behavior, and you can tell from space whether somebody is building a new gas-fired power plant. So it's also more observable and verifiable.
So I'll watch with interest. Finally, I just wondered, based on your own research, but also the many things that we've discussed that are going on at Jesus College and at the University of Cambridge more widely, are there any practical lessons for other institutions on using their shareholder influence or their investment powers on how they might really underpin environmental efforts and drive towards these net zero targets?
Absolutely. I would say there are two things. So first, there are some things that you don't have to bother doing anymore. I'm actually not a fan of net zero targets. The net is a bit suspect, and typically these are pretty gameable targets that go out well into the future. So I think my first piece of advice for fellow asset owners is to really focus on the current activities of your asset managers, banks, and the underlying companies. So I would say, I mean, switching banks is one of the more impactful things that you can do, especially if you engage with the bank a lot in the lead up. With your asset managers, they should be voting against the directors of companies that are still engaging in fossil fuel expansion at this late stage. And if they're not, then switching asset managers and explaining why is very important. If you do switch banks or asset managers, announcing it is actually really important for social discourse reasons. And then I suppose just in general, having this lens around fossil fuel expansion is quite important, and really focusing on debt financing of fossil fuel expansion and voting against the directors of companies that are engaging in fossil fuel expansion. So you can actually pair those two strategies. You could vote against the directors on the public equity side, or divest entirely and just have your asset manager oppose directors engaging in fossil fuel expansion, and kind of combine the tools that way. But the main thing is just to make sure that you are not working with institutions who are getting your business and yet contributing in negative ways to the number one issue of our time, climate change. It really is something that there's a lot of gameability around this. There are a lot of glossy reports put out by asset managers and others making some pretty bold claims. I've actually created a couple of bingo cards to help people identify the most common loopholes and evasions. And actually, we have an online course as well that'll be coming out in the next little while to help people identify these things as well. But basically, I think having a good dose of skepticism and being able to identify the things that your asset managers and banks are doing that are, in fact, not as green as it may first appear, that would be a pretty important element to or a good mindset with which to approach this whole issue, given the amount of relatively ineffective tools and products that are being pushed at asset owners.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I'm not suggesting it's easy to switch your bank, switch your asset manager. Obviously, that takes work and proper due diligence, however you do it. But it is something that any institution can do. That is a practical step that is very, very eminently achievable. I think your point that net zero, and the net is probably the key part of that, is gameable, is a very good one to highlight, because of course there's a lot of talk about whether offsetting is really the way to go, and then there's all sorts of ways of playing with the figures and playing with how you measure these things that make it quite complicated. And a lot of what you've talked about here is not just about using your power to be influential, but also about making these things more transparent. I think you talk about, announcing if you switch asset managers, but also the bond index itself helping to demonstrate and make transparent what is going on. Because for a lot of people at varying levels, I think it can just be quite hard to know who is actually doing the right thing and where. So I'm intrigued. What are on your bingo cards?
I'll just give one example. Several banks I've seen have commitments not to directly finance particular projects, but actually project financing is not how the vast majority of new fossil fuel exploration activities or new infrastructure is actually built. So it's kind of a meaningless restriction. Most new capital flowing into fossil fuel expansion is at the company level. So the company is issuing bonds or getting a bank loan, and then with that money, they are going and doing various projects. So it's general corporate financing that is where the money is coming from, not project financing. So that's just one example.
Great. Well, look, there's a huge amount to pick over there, and it's absolutely fascinating to hear about this stuff that's going on in the background, perhaps, and it isn't the big glossy headline, but fundamentally maybe going to make a much greater impact than a lot of those things that look very showy. So lots for anyone working in higher education to consider, and indeed anyone working elsewhere. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today, Ellen.
Thank you so much, Miranda. These are great questions. Thanks for noticing the difference between what you've seen in the Jesus College investment policy and the other ones you've seen.
What a great interview. As a layperson, I really appreciated how Ellen explained the depths of consideration that ethical investment requires. So the underlying finances of oil and gas projects that I can't even begin to pretend to understand, and why it's important to look at what companies are doing rather than what their glossy brochures say they are committed to doing.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I thought her point about, she referred a few times to how things can be gamified, and actually net zero being one of them. And I can see that is a problem because it's in some cases become essentially a branding exercise. So yes, looking at the action seems to be the only sensible way forward. And on the subject of action, I think we should hear from Jenna. Over to you, Eliza.
I think so. Well, indeed. So from high-level financial influence that universities have over fossil fuel production to the lab-based actions that researchers and technicians can take to make their own science more sustainable. I reached out to Jenna Lowe, who is the Laboratory Sustainability Officer at the University of Liverpool, and she explained to me how Liverpool has embraced UCL's Laboratory Efficiency Assessment Framework to help make the labs across the university more sustainable. And she gives lots of practical tips about how to save money and time, as well as the planet.
Science is a resource-intensive exercise. Life science laboratories account for about 2% of global plastic waste, according to a 2015 study from the University of Exeter, and use up to 10 times more energy per square metre than a typical office block. In fact, ULT freezers, which are responsible for about 2/3 of lab energy use in life science laboratories, consume the same amount of energy as a semi-detached house. So, what can labs do to reduce energy, water and plastic use and make their science more sustainable? To help answer this question, I'm joined by Jenna Lowe. Jenna is the Laboratory Sustainability Officer at the University of Liverpool. She manages the Laboratory Efficiency Assessment Framework for all of the more than 150 laboratories across 3 faculties at the university and is a member of the sustainability team. She's a passionate advocate of greener research practices and was shortlisted in the Outstanding Technician of the Year category in the 2024 THE Awards. Our conversation is taking place during Climate Impact Week, so it seems especially timely. Jenna, welcome to the Campus Podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Now, technicians are often unsung heroes on campus, so can you tell us a bit about what the job entails?
Yeah, sure. So being a technician, there is a really broad range of different jobs that you can do. Myself, I was a core technician in some of our biological research labs on campus. Basically, that involved on a day-to-day basis running our laboratories, making sure everyone was working safely, doing the autoclave, the wash up, the cleaning. I also got to be involved in a lot of research projects that were undertaken. So researchers could buy my time and I could be dedicated on the project to work for them. I was also had to learn all the different techniques that we undertook in the laboratory, such as ELISAs, PCR, cell culture, so that then when we had students coming in, be that undergraduate, master students, new PhD students, I could help to train the people in those techniques and how to run them, how to work safely within the laboratory. So it really did encompass everything, basically. So yes, I agree. The technicians definitely are the backbone of the laboratories. I stepped aside from the lab to take a secondment in laboratory sustainability, which is where I kind of got into the role that I am doing now.
Well, you've given us a nice segue there. What is it that makes labs such energy-intensive spaces?
I think the equipment that we use in the labs, the equipment that we need to keep the labs running is extremely energy intensive. As you said, some stats before, one ultra low temperature freezer can use the same energy as one UK household per year. And if we talk about Liverpool, in our health and life sciences faculty, we have over 400 ultra low temperature freezers. So that's kind of, you're running a little village there in energy costs. Fume hoods, they can use the same energy as 2 to 3 UK households per year. And within our chemistry department, we have hundreds and hundreds of fume hoods within that building. And then you've got smaller items of equipment as well. And they may not seem like, oh, they're small, they're not going to use a lot of energy. It all adds up. And having all this equipment on all the time, it really puts a pressure on the HVAC systems as well. So the air conditioning, the heating is having to work harder to maintain a stable temperature within the lab. I managed to get some data from one of our basic office buildings versus one of our basic lab buildings and compared the energy. And the energy from our lab building was about 10 times more than it was from the office building.
Yeah, they're really surprising statistics, aren't they? In 2021, Liverpool was one of 4 universities that piloted UCL's Laboratory Efficiency Assessment Framework, known more usually by its acronym of LEAF, working with the National Technicians Development Centre. You have mentioned that the landscape on the campus is quite diverse, so I imagine a framework like this is quite useful. Can you tell us a bit about it and how it has changed or informed your practice?
Yes, of course. Yeah, so as you say, we do have a diverse range of laboratories on our campus. So we have biological labs, we have chemistry labs, we have engineering, physics, environmental sciences, to name but a few. There are so many out there. And I think what LEAF has done, and it is viable across all these different laboratories, it's really made people think about what they're doing within the labs. And I've had people comment to me saying, I'm so glad I got involved in this because it's actually made me think about this and it's made me make the changes. So with LEAF, what you do is there are 3 levels, bronze, silver and gold. And with each level, there are more actions to take to gain those levels. At the minute, we have 95% of our labs with an award of bronze or above, which is fantastic. So if you go in at the bronze level, it's looking at, some examples here are your waste bins. Do you have the correct waste bins in your lab? Are they all signed? Is the signage clear? Do people know where to put their different waste streams? And that means you're not putting recycling into a clinical waste bin when you can recycle it and it should be put in there. So, most labs should already have that anyway, but it's just checking that, making sure you've got a standing operating procedure for waste as well. Because we've got so many different labs on campus, each lab runs in a different way, each lab is dealing with different hazards. It's very much different in each lab. You can't have a one fits all. So it's about the labs creating this for themselves. We kind of look into chemical management. Are all your chemicals labelled? Are all your samples labelled? Can you identify what you've got within your lab so that you can clearly get rid of things when they're no longer needed, which kind of links into having an exit checklist for when someone leaves the lab so that, their samples don't end up staying in a freezer for 10 years, which is quite common. It's about getting those procedures in place now so that 5-10 years down the line, we've not got that buildup of samples and it's easier to keep track of them, and that can help with freeing up freezer space as well, so we don't need to purchase as many freezers. Also kind of looks into the use of fume hoods. Are users trained in how to use them? Are the sashes being lowered when they're not in use? Because that can save a lot of energy. And then it's all about conversations as well, bringing up sustainability as a standing agenda item in meetings that you have, because you'll find out there's so many people out there with so many different ideas, and it's great to share these between not just your lab, but other labs within your department, other labs within your institute or school, and it really gets the conversation going, and then we find more things being implemented because people are having these conversations. So the Bronze Award is in a nutshell kind of like that. There is a lot of other things as well. As you go up to silver, you're looking more at what can you do to reduce the amount of plastics coming into your labs? How can you look at that? What can you actually physically do about that? Goes more into freezer maintenance. So we have an ultra low temperature freezer guidance list with a maintenance checklist, and going for silver, you have to be filling out this maintenance checklist because that will make your freezers more efficient and that will reduce your energy consumption. Looks into autoclaving, how you're running your autoclaving. Are you batching them? You're not just running it when you've got one item. Are you making sure it's full, creating those schedules? So it kind of goes more into a deep dive. And then as you get up to the gold award around the consumables, it's give me specific examples of where you're reusing consumables and how that has impacted and reduced the amount of waste going out from your lab. So it kind of builds on all these topics. We're looking at, travel, office spaces, and it really adds up to that. And, we do have some labs on our campus which are gold, and they've been doing some fantastic work to reduce everything that they can reduce. And it's really fantastic to see that. And as I said before, the labs that have done this, they're super, super keen and they really want to go up those levels. And it's fantastic to see.
So you mentioned gold. I think Liverpool's got 8 gold accredited labs. Is that right?
Yes.
And it seems like having a systematized checklist makes organising this kind of activity and, more importantly, measuring it and evidencing it easier. Is there a particular success story within Liverpool that has brought out particularly surprising or unexpected or more significant results?
It's really difficult. I was thinking about this. It's really difficult to pinpoint one. I've really gotten to see how labs, some labs have gone back and switched completely to glassware. So they're barely using any plastic at all, which is great. And there are papers out there which show that reusing glassware and washing it is actually more environmentally friendly than using the plasticware. We've had labs who have worked with suppliers to reduce the energy consumption on pieces of equipment they use. So they've gone out of their way to contact the supplier and say, is there any way I can switch this equipment off or parts of this equipment? And I think that resulted in it was a 30% energy reduction in the equipment just by working with the supplier on that. We've had labs where suppliers have been contacting them and saying, is everything okay? Because, your consumable use has gone down significantly by like 50%. And we're just making sure that nothing's changed within the labs. And it's just purely by changing one aspect of the way they ran things, they managed to reduce that plasticware by 50%. Some of our labs that have got golds, when you look at the consumables they use and how they run, obviously we still have to comply with health and safety regulations. We still have to make sure that that's set in place, but everything that they can reuse, they are reusing, and it has been fantastic to see.
Do you have a mechanism within Liverpool to share best practice in this area?
Yes, we do. So I create guidance documents and I've shared them with all the labs about ideas and hints and tips about what they can do. Obviously, not everything will work for every lab because of the variety of different labs we have, but we also have a Leave Team site where people can contribute anything that they've done. I've got a listserv email address where if I've seen something in a lab and that lab is happy for me to communicate to other labs, then I can do it by that. Or I can say to a lab, are you happy for me to share this with other labs within your department? And most of them have been like, yeah, that's absolutely great. Go ahead. It would be great to see other labs get involved in this as well. So, putting people in contact with other people who are already doing these things as well. It's really made a little community in our LEAF program.
Yeah, what a fantastic community of practice. You've mentioned all the sorts of different variables that can come into play, so energy, water, plastic. I imagine there are some things that you can't change. What sorts of variables have to be negotiated or worked around, for want of a better way of putting it?
So for example, within our biological labs, we have, work that goes on where everything needs to be sterile, everything needs to be clean. We can't reuse the plasticware for fear of contamination. So when it comes to that, it's very much like, okay, I understand that cannot be changed. I'm not going to penalise you on from leaf for things that are beyond your control. So we are going to still have single-use plastics. We are going to still have to use autoclaves in the way that we do, just purely from that aspect. When it comes to using water in water baths, we do still have to add the chemicals to prevent contamination and things like that. So yes, there are things we will never be able to change, but within those labs, we can look at what we can change. So, there'll be the things that have to be sterile and the things that we still need to use a single-use plastic for, but then we can look at other aspects of the protocol and say, well, can you change, once you don't need the sterility anymore, can you change this part? Can we look at using glassware here instead of plasticware? Can we look at the equipment usage that you need? Do you really need that equipment to be on all the time? Can you switch it off after use? And little things like that where we can make changes. I'm really happy to work with the labs themselves, especially when they're coming up to gold, to say, okay, I'll sit down and let's look at your lab operations as a whole and talk through it. Because, I'm not an expert in what goes on in every single lab on campus, and I don't want to be telling labs to do things when they can't. So I'm always happy to have those open conversations and see what can be changed in those areas.
And do sustainability practices affect funding at all? So are funders looking for evidence of more sustainable practices?
Yes. So one of the things to come out, obviously, as the University of Liverpool, we were an early signatory on the Environmental Sustainability Concordat. And, on the back of that, we do have some funders such as Wellcome, such as CRUK, who are saying from January, they're not going to fund a lab that doesn't have a LEAF or equivalent accreditation. So I think Wellcome is saying bronze, CRUK is saying silver. So it's very important that we make sure that our labs that receive those funding from those two funding bodies have a LEAF accreditation at the appropriate level. But it's not just those, and we're getting other academics coming up to us from applying for funding from other funders who are saying, oh, there's a question here around what's my lab doing towards sustainability. We have the LEAF award, who did this for our lab? What did they do? So it is becoming a big thing amongst all the funders, and it really helps to drive that sustainability forward. And a lot of the academics are coming up to us and saying, if they didn't have LEAF before, we really need to get LEAF now. Are you happy to come to my lab and we can discuss it and we can start the process? So yeah, it's definitely becoming a big thing now.
So lots of tangible benefits besides benefiting the planet, and also extrapolating from what you said before, if you're reducing energy use or using less single-use plastic, then I presume that makes your operating costs in the laboratory also lower.
Yes, 100%. Yeah, if you're using less, you're buying less. So yeah, definitely has a big impact on cost saving as well, and the energy and water bills from the university. So it really is a win-win situation.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think in one interview I listened to, you mentioned putting polystyrene boxes into the ultra low temperature freezers to improve their efficiency. Are there other easy wins that labs can take to reduce their energy, water, or plastic use?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, as well as the polystyrene boxes, as I mentioned before, we have our ultra low temperature freezer maintenance checklist. And that really involves monthly, quarterly, annual checks, basically. So scraping away any excess ice monthly, cleaning the filters as well. Annually, we say defrost. But if you keep up with scraping the excess ice away, if you keep up with cleaning your filters, you shouldn't have to then defrost it annually. So it saves a lot of time on the technicians as well as having the maintenance on the freezer. We also recommend that labs make inventories of what samples they've got in there, because if you know where your sample is, and then you can literally go into the freezer, open the door, go into the freezer, pull out your sample and close the freezer door very quickly. Because for every minute the freezer door is open, it takes 10 minutes for it to get back down to temperature, which is then using more energy. So those are the certain things around ultra-lows that we've said, and it has been shown that by doing these things you can reduce the energy consumption by between 30 and 50% purely by just doing those little bits of maintenance. Around fume hoods, we recommend, close the sash when you're not using it. That can save 30% of energy as well. Just be mindful of how you're working within the fume hood. Don't block the sides and the airflow, because that will make the fume hood work harder as well. Don't use it for storage. You don't need to store all your items under there. Just bring them in when you use them, take them out when you're finished. And we've got some posters that I created around sustainable use of fume hoods, which also incorporates health and safety as well, because we do have to be mindful of that. So certain things like that. We ran a switch off. So we've got switch off stickers for all our equipment. So 3 stickers that basically do not switch off, please get permission before switching off, and switch off when not in use, because we found that maybe some people would come into the lab and they've used a piece of equipment, they don't know if they can turn it off or not. So just by putting these stickers on, someone will know, oh yeah, I can turn that off, or oh no, I better not turn that off if it's not going to work if I do turn it off. So things like that have really helped in that energy consumption. So those are one of the things we recommend, again, when it comes to consumables and reducing that use. We recommend people plan their experiments in advance so that they can plan what consumables are going to need, and that reduces the waste. Using refill tip systems can reduce the amount of plastic by 63%. We do recommend washing and reusing consumables if you can. And I always use the example of when I was working in the labs. I was doing a project where I had 200 odd ELISA plates to run, and I was using serological pipettes, and I was using reagent reservoirs as well. And I basically just washed and reused the same ones for the whole entire experiment for the same solution, and it never affected the results. And the amount that I saved, I would have gone through, 5 per plate rather than 5 per 200 plates. So, looking at things like that, thinking, actually, I can do that. And that saved a lot of money on the project as well. Looking to replace the plasticware with glassware, as I said before, just little things like that. And as I say, I'm always happy to talk to the labs and see what's out there, what's more sustainable products that are out there that they can purchase versus what they're purchasing now. So all these things together really can add up and make a difference. And even if labs think that the changes they're making, that's only small, it doesn't really seem significant. I say everything makes a difference. You might think it's small, but over time that really adds up. So I always say to the labs, tell me everything, put everything into your LEAF application.
And do you have to go around regularly and visit all the labs?
Yeah, so the LEAF accreditation runs for a year. So after a year, the labs need to renew. They can either stick at the same level or they can increase a level. So at the minute, a lot of our labs are going from bronze to silver. So I am going out annually when the labs do renew. UCL also update the LEAF criteria every year. So there are different extra things for the labs to work towards. So when they've got these extra questions to fill out, or questions that have changed and had components added to it, I also go out and check that they're meeting these extra criteria as well.
Absolutely. Is AI one of those criteria? I keep reading about how much energy and water AI uses.
Yeah, not specifically. So LEAF has a couple of questions in silver and gold around your data storage and your data use, and minimizing storage clusters per se. There is a more specific data framework called Green Disk that is something that we're starting to explore here at Liverpool, which is more for our computational labs.
Yeah, it's an interesting space, that one, absolutely. Just as a final question, what are you looking at in the future?
Well, at the minute, it's so we released a new sustainability strategy earlier this year, and as part of that, we put a few KPIs around LEAF in there. So and that kind of aligns with our broader Liverpool 2031 strategy. So one of those strategies was to make sure that we've gone for 80% of Lab Silver by January 2026, and that's really to align with the funders. So at the minute, I'm just making sure that those funders, those labs that are funded by Wellcome and CR UK do have the correct accreditation. Beyond that, we said that we would like all of our labs gold by 2031, which is an ambitious target, but I would like to think that it is doable. Yeah, so those are my immediate plans.
Yeah, well, based on the figures that you've shared with us, it sounds like those goals will have a huge impact. Thank you so much for your time today, Jenna.
No worries, thank you.
That conversation is really heartening in how clearly it demonstrates the power of small changes, small steps, and the fact that simply closing a freezer door quicker could lead to, I think she said, 30 to 50% energy savings. That's just extraordinary. I also feel her repeated point, kind of underlying just core message that everything, however small, makes a difference, is a really good mantra for all of us to remember and apply throughout our lives. But Jenna does also highlight why this is so tricky for universities. I mean, she admits there are some non-negotiables in terms of, for instance, single-use plastic, or the fact that laboratories will always be very energy-hungry places. And I guess that's where, a benefits versus cost analysis becomes important, but also perhaps where offsetting and seeking greener energy sources becomes really vitally important.
Yeah, absolutely. And really walking that fine line between doing science that is of the highest standard, but also with the minimal possible footprint. And I think Jenna, being on the ground in the way that she is, seemed to give a really clear picture of where meaningful change could be made, even as far as going back to looking at how suppliers interact with the laboratories, which seems to me to be getting into scope 3 and supply chain, which I think is the biggest contributor to the university sector's carbon emissions. And also the importance of communities of practice and putting in really clear, open, with plenty of entry points, initiatives that researchers can use to share the things that they're doing that are making that difference.
Yes, absolutely. So to take Jenna's message, focus on what you can do. And for more advice and perhaps inspiration in how you can support the battle against climate change, whether through your teaching, your research, or simply empowering your students to take action, head to campus. You'll find reams of advice from those engaged in this work. It is all at www.timeshighereducation.com/campus. If you enjoyed the podcast, please like and subscribe, and we will be back with you in a couple of weeks. Bye-bye.
You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.